Thank you for joining us today. Let's get started with our webinar. Before we begin, please let me welcome Ahon Wakarone to open us up in a good way. He is Kahnawà Environment Protection Officer. He is Kahnawà Environment Protection Office's environmental technician, starting in June 2021. Previously, he worked as a language and culture teacher at the Kahnawà Survival School and brings with him valuable experience in educational fields. Ahon Wakarone hope is to impart traditional teachings with KEPO to assist in having a stronger connection to the natural world. Let's introduce you to our first speaker. Oh, sorry, over to you. Anin Bojo, Minogija, Carrie and Charles Dishnikaz, Ashun Young Dunjiba, Mayengan Doram, Anishtapa Kwet and Dow, Beandagan. Hello, good morning. I'm Carrie Ann. I am from the Chippewas of Georgiana Island First Nation, and I'm of the Wolf Clan. I'm a proud Anishinaabe woman. Welcome. I'm first and foremost a proud First Nations woman, but I am also the Environment Partnership Coordinator for Cambium Indigenous Professional Services, or as we like to call ourselves, SIPS, and a member of the Latornell Symposium Steering Committee. I am here with you today, speaking from Egypt as I attend COP27 as a delegate for the Commission for Environmental Cooperation as their Indigenous lead, speaking on the importance of Indigenous inclusion, but more importantly, Indigenous leadership in adapting and mitigating our changing climate, and on behalf of the Latornell Steering Committee, Conservation Ontario, and the University of Guelph. I'd like to welcome you all to our second webinar, Healing Our Connection to Water and Place Through Habitat Creation, in the follow-up to our in-person symposium held October 17th and 18th at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Hamilton. A few housekeeping notes for you this morning. First, all of our attendees are muted and you will not be able to speak or come on video. You will find a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to ask any of our panelists a question, please type it in the box and press enter to have it posted. If you could include which panelists you would like to address your question, that would help us as well. You can also upvote a question you like by pressing the thumbs up. We will be reviewing the questions and we'll have time to pose a few of them to our panelists at the end of the presentations. Feel free to interact with others in the webinar through the chat box. And to our panelists, a reminder to use your mute button when you are not speaking, and of course to unmute yourself when you are. This webinar is being recorded so that members or others who are not able to attend will be able to listen in at their leisure. As the recognition of Indigenous knowledge and perspectives in environmental conservation continues to increasingly grow and be meaningfully pursued to help inform decision-making for the benefit of all beings, I was recruited to this committee in 2017 to assist in ensuring Indigenous inclusion and participation within the Latornell Symposium. I'm super excited and honored today to moderate this session. Being a First Nations woman working in the environment field, I see firsthand all the work that needs to be undertaken to assist Aki Kwe, Mother Earth, to begin a healing process that has been caused by years of disrespect and mistreatment. Clear cutting of trees, mining of her minerals, and pollution of her waterways, which are the lifelines for all of us, are having a detrimental effect, and we are now at a tipping point where we must all come together to assist her on her path to healing. Another factor that is increasingly being realized and correlated to the decline in her health is the attempted colonization and assimilation of Indigenous peoples around the world. Gifted with an intimate connection to her and the knowledge to live in harmony with her, the Indigenous peoples have for hundreds of years been suppressed in sharing of our knowledge and upholding of our responsibilities bestowed upon us to protect and conserve those that cannot speak for themselves and whom provide all that is needed to achieve a good life, or Minopamadzuin, as the Anishinaabe call it. The deliberate incorporation of Indigenous peoples' perspectives and knowledge are integral to the decisions being made that will ensure that not only do we all have a healthy environment to live in, but so will our next 7 generations. Today, I am privileged to introduce you to amazing guests that will share with you and us projects that have been undertaken that combine both Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, as well as Western knowledge. With that, I will introduce you to our speakers, our first speakers. Cole Dazal. Cole is an environment project coordinator, terrestrial habitats with Kahnawà Environment Protection Office, and started working with KEPO as a summer student before joining the team full time in 2019. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology from Concordia University. He leads the Emerald Ash Borer Project, Enhanced Maritime Situational Awareness Program, and has assisted in implementing the Recreation Bay Restoration Program since starting at KEPO. Our second speaker is Patrick Regaz. Patrick is the General Manager of Field Science for the Kahnawà Environment Protection Office and has been an employee of the Mohawk Council of Kahnawà since 2013. He has a background in water resources engineering and wildlife biology and has been working as an ally to the community to advance restoration projects, rehabilitate contaminated sites, lead inspection activities, and is also a member of the MCK Consultation Committee. With that, I welcome both Cole and Patrick.
Thank you, Carrie-Ann. Before I begin, I'd just like to invite Hunkarane to finish the opening.
Yeah, my apologies. I got booted out.
Migrat for that, Hone Goronane. And apologies. I thought I was frozen on my end. Technology, I guess this is the world we live in. But I did get a little bit ahead of myself. So before we get into your presentation, Cole, I'd like to call upon Mario to give us the poll results. So it looks like we've got most of the participants in Southwestern Ontario. We've got some in the GTA, some in Central Ontario, and we've got 11% outside of Ontario. So Miigwech, and now over to you, Cole.
Thanks, Carrie-Ann, and Hunkarane. We just get this sharing. All right, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Like Carrie-Ann said, I'm Cole DeLille from the Kahnawà Environment Protection Office. I'm going to be joined by Patrick Regaz, who will be presenting the second half of our presentation. Today, we're going to be telling you about the Tekakwitha Island and Bay Restoration Project. But before we get into the work we've done, I'd like to give you a bit of a history about Kahnawà and the circumstances that made it necessary to have a Bay Restoration Project. I guess a bit about our organization. The Kahnawà Environment Protection Office is a part of the Mohawk Council of Kahnawà. And we're responsible for taking care of our land in all aspects. So besides restoration work, we do work on contaminated sites, soil inspections, monitoring rivers and waterways, and a few other areas, education for a community. So this is Kahnawà. The place on the rapids is what the name roughly translates to. It's located south of the island of Montreal, so you can see in the pictures up there, that's the island of Montreal and the Mercier Bridge. In the picture there, you can also see the St. Lawrence Seaway and the St. Lawrence River, the northern part of the community. Kahnawà is surrounded by highly developed communities. We have, well, of course, Montreal, we have St. Constant and St. Catherine, and we have Chateauguay. So Kahnawà is sort of this little green square where we have a lot of natural wetlands left. But besides that, we have some challenges with infrastructure coming through the community. I mean, most obviously the St. Lawrence River Seaway, but also the Mercier Bridge that I mentioned, highways 132 and 138, and rail lines. So these images show the old village area of Kahnawà before the St. Lawrence Seaway came through. So we can see in here how the community got its name, the place on the rapids. All of the houses in the old village area are right on the river itself. So in the past, people in the community made their livelihoods from fishing and from farming. There was even a ferry service you can see in one of the pictures that would take the people across the river to Lachine to do their shopping or to work. The river was like part of their way of life. And as we go through, I'm going to point out some reference points just for everyone so we can know where we are. So if you see in the bottom left picture here, we have the church and the road in front of it. So as we go through, just keep in mind where that church is, because it's going to show up in some of the other pictures. You can see it in the top left picture as well. So the river was an important part of our identity. My great-grandparents' house is actually in the old village area. My cousin lives there now. So I think it would be this house here. It might be one over. But I remember hearing stories about how the river was such a way of life in those days before the seaway came through. The women and the children would go down to the river in the mornings and they would wash their clothes there. The children would play there. People would be fishing and gathering, and they lived as part of the river itself. And another building I'm going to point out that we'll see if, as we go further, is right here. So I believe this is the old hospital building. So if you follow the road up towards the left there, you can see where it forks. So I think that's the location of it, but we're going to see that building soon in another slide. I'll go back to it too. So as I had mentioned before, our ancestors were used to changes and impositions on our territory. Pieces of the community were taken bit by our neighbors for railway lines, hydro lines, highways, and bridges. The community adapted to all of the changes that happened over time. You can see these women here enjoying some time by the river. This is an area known as Flat Rocks. People still go there for swimming and to have picnics, but it's much harder to get to than it was in these days. But no changes that happened to community were as tragic or as transformative as the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway. The Seaway severed our access to the river in the mid-1950s. More than 1,300 acres of our land was expropriated, and the community fought this expropriation as best people could at the time. It's just devastating to see the pictures of how much land was taking, and like I can't imagine living at that time and seeing these changes. People tell stories about what this expropriation was like, the coercion, the lies, and the empty promises and forced evictions of the families who were living in the wake of the Seaway. They tell us about a great sadness that came to the community in the mid-1950s when the work on the Seaway began. The children would actually go into the Seaway itself, into the construction areas at night, and steal the survey pegs to try and stop the project. But of course, the St. Lawrence Seaway project wasn't going to be stopped because of the economic benefits that would bring to Canada and the United States. And the anger and trauma that people felt from this construction wasn't going to be brought to an end either. People were just bewildered by the changes that happened to the community. So as a result, Kahnawà, the place on the rapids, is no longer on the rapids. You see right there in the northern half of the community, the seaway just cut off the access to the river where people lived. The community was cut off from gathering places. They lost access to their fishing spots. And so here's another shot of the community before the seaway. And just pay attention to that road that runs along in the center of the image there, because that road is still there today. And you can see how it just cut through the community. I'm just going to show that again. In this old picture too, you can see how the land was used. You can see it's sort of mixed forest as well as farmland. And then let's do the transition. So this area you see here that's cut through by the seaway on the northern side there is still part of Kahnawà. This area is called the North Wall. People still use this area for fishing and hunting, but to get there, they have to go through neighboring St. Catherine and go across the lift bridge. So this is a 20 to 30-minute drive, except of course, if there's a ship coming and the lift bridge has to go up. So that could add an extra 30 to 45 minutes, depending on how many ships are coming through. So we still use the land, but it's just much more difficult for us. So because of the St. Lawrence Seaway, our connection to the river eroded. A study was carried out in late 90s in collaboration with the McGill Center for Indigenous Nutrition and Environment. The study found that many people regarded fishing as a cultural activity of the past. They were afraid of eating the fish due to contamination concerns, and the move from traditional food associated with that came with a dramatic increase in diabetes. And I'll just show that transition again. So all of this sort of area you can see right on the river was homes, and these were the people who were, I think, most heavily affected by the expropriations. I just heard a story recently that one of the people, an older couple who lived in the area, were the last to refuse to move. They weren't accepting the buyout by the seaway. And so as time went on, they just kept building the seaway around them. And so they were sort of a little peninsula in the middle of it before they were eventually forced to move. Some of the material dug up from the seaway from the bottom was left in a barren mess along the seaway shore. The area today is known as the Clay Mountains. Some of this area is residential. Some of this is still barren rock and a mess that nothing really grows on. See that transition again. So we can see it was all farmland at the time. And just to show you what it's like to live in Kahnawà now, I have this short video. If that works. There we go. So with the swimming spots destroyed, people would swim in the seaway. And of course, when you're swimming in the seaway, you face massive shipping vessels passing just feet away from you. I used to do paddling when I was a teenager, and we would paddle down from the canoe club towards the Mercier Bridge, and then you'd be passing these ships, and then you have to learn to face the waves head on, or else you're going to tip. It's not really fun if it's a really cold day. So homes along the seaway path that are along the seaway itself now just shake as ships pass from the engines. Eventually, the ships just became part of our landscape. Personally, having grown up along the water and seeing these ships up close my entire life, it's just become normalized for me. But then you see the reactions of people who haven't seen that before, and it's just, you realize that it's not normal. So the clay and the riprap material from the excavation of the seaway wasn't just placed on the Clay Mountains area. It was also placed over our islands. So you can see them on the left-hand side of the image there in the river. There's, I think there was 5 islands. And what they did was they filled in between them with a riprap material. And to make one island that we call Tekakwitha Island today. You can actually see on the southern side of that island, there's just a tip of forested area. And if I go back, you can see that's part of one of the original islands. It's like the center island there. Let's watch that again. I'd just like to share this quote from the president of the St. Lawrence Seaway Authority at the time of construction. This promise. We made plans to maintain a good swimming area at the upper end of the village, and we're making arrangements to keep the water in the bay fresh. Lino Chevrier, 1956. What the community received for a good swimming area was a community pool, which eventually fell into disrepair and was demolished. So the bay was our last access to the river, and the bay is our last access to the river, and the community shifted its focus to this area over time. The canoe club was established. That's it right there, Onage, and people tried to maintain their traditional activities despite the seaway. After a few short decades, changes to the bay started to become apparent. The water levels were lower. The bay was filling up with sediment, and aquatic plants were proliferating to the extent that paddling in the bay was impossible for most of the summer months. The overgrowth of the plant material and concerns about the future access to the bay prompted our office to begin studies to understand the state of Tekakwitha Island in the bay. The rocky shorelines that were left behind were clearly barriers to wildlife like turtles, which would need to access the island to lay their eggs. So this is just a material that was brought up from the bottom of the seaway, and no effort was made to naturalize it. It was just left on the shores. Much of the vegetation that was growing on the island were monocultures of invasive species or the hardiest native plants. Because of the material on the island is just rock, and there is barely any topsoil. These studies demonstrated to us that there would be no easy solutions to remediation of the bay and the island. In the decades since its creation, the issues which came from filling in over the natural islands and cutting off access to the river compounded. It was becoming clear that without intervention, issues such as invasive species, sediment accumulation would only get worse, and something needed to be done. So I guess in conclusion, the infrastructure crossing our community provides immense benefits to our neighbors, to the economy, to Quebec, Canada, and the United States, but it does so at the continued detriment to our community. In Kahnawà, we are left with the reality that the St. Lawrence Seaway is not going anywhere, but neither are we. What we can do now is teach our kids about the river. Kids never knew Kahnawà as it was before the Seaway. I never did, but it's important that to get teachings about their culture and the traditions to build a new relationship to the river, to learn the skills that our ancestors had about fishing and navigating the river. We at Kipo were committed to restoring the bay, our last access to river, and making sure it's in a good condition so we can continue and revive the traditions of swimming, paddling, fishing on the river. And we hope to encourage the next generations to protect the river as our ancestors did. So thank you all. I'm going to pass things over to Patrick to share more on our restoration project.
Great, thank you for that background, Cole. I hope that's sharing properly there now. But as Cole mentioned, I think he provided good history of why we're got to the place that we were at. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Tekakwitha Island and Bay Restoration Project that the community has undertaken over the last several years. Talk a little bit about the process of how we got to the point of undertaking this project, some of the challenges that we faced along the way, and just walk through some of the elements that have been constructed. So the goals of the project, we were working with the Kahnawà Environment Protection Office, but based on the history Cole provided, really the primary goal was just to enable the community use and access of the area, both the canoe club in the water, and then also just improve the suitability of the island for a number of community activities, and then also to improve and enhance the environment as we move forward. So project development, we have known that there's been issues in the bay for quite some time. So in 2008, there was some early work done just looking at the shorelines in the community. We continued on in 2011, trying to identify, what those problems were in more detail. And then as we moved along, we were undertaking some studies to try to understand, why those problems are occurring. Once we had a good handle on that, we did some modeling to understand the best solutions that could address those problems. Then moved into a detailed design for the project. In 2019, we're working on environmental assessment process, permitting, and tendering. And then the project was constructed between 2020 and 2022. So it was a long timeline that we've been working on this project. I would say it wasn't necessarily continuous. There were often challenges trying to secure funding for different aspects of the work. So this is the project area, the bay, walking through here. So I guess first, the upstream contribution, right? So the project is on the St. Lawrence River. However, there's a river that enters the river just upstream, the Chattagee River, and that's a large agricultural watershed. So anytime there's rainfall, we get quite a bit of nutrients and sediment entering the bay, entering that river, which then you can see here along the line, there's a divide between the brown water coming from the Chattagee River and the St. Lawrence River behind, and that's visible in this image as well. And so a lot of that water coming from the Chattagee River doesn't mix with the St. Lawrence before it gets to Kahnawà in the bay. So we get a lot of that sediment entering the bay. The outlet to the bay enters into the St. Lawrence Seaway itself. And so that doesn't, the St. Lawrence Seaway is a controlled flow system. So the flow is fairly constant year round, meaning that we don't get any flushing flows or more significant movement through the bay that might help move some of that sediment out that enters the bay. So one other aspect is this constriction from the former remnant island piece that Cole had mentioned earlier. Flow sort of accelerates, the velocity accelerates through that area, and then we found that there's been a large deposition just immediately downstream of that as the bay widens out again. And just looking up the bay, you can see there's quite a lot of aquatic plants taking advantage of that nutrient-laden sediment, which has led to the problems of difficulty paddling for the community. And through some of the studies, we found that is also beginning to have detrimental impacts to the fish community in the area. As we started the project with the focus on getting flow moving through the bay again, we recognized that the island itself was also an area that could use some improvements. As Cole mentioned, there's a sharp, the shoreline is riprap and quite steep slope. So that caused some issues for wildlife and people trying to move between the bay and the water. And the island itself is flat, 100% flat, and very poor soil, just being the rock and clay material that had been excavated from the seaway and dumped onto these islands. So for the in-water works, the plan through our modeling, 3 components had been identified to improve the flow through the bay. So one was just increasing the flow in the St. Lawrence Seaway itself, and working with the St. Lawrence Seaway Management Corporation, we were able to have them increase the flow in the seaway by about 40%. So one element that helps move some more water through the bay. Additionally, dredging through that shoal area that I had mentioned. So we did a 40-meter channel to try to concentrate flow and hence velocity in a narrower band in the bay, try to keep things moving through the center, and then following that up with removal of aquatic plants all the way to the outlet. So those were the design goals there. And then on the island itself, we had a couple of large habitat creation zones. So this natural zone 1 consisted of a pond in the center with marsh, wet meadow, shrub swamp, and terrestrial habitats created moving out from that pond. I just want to highlight too that we were tackling invasive species through this project. And you can see here a small patch of Phragmites that was identified on the shoreline. We had some Japanese knotweed here as well. And I'll speak to the Phragmites in a little bit. The second natural zone that we were creating was targeted towards turtles, and it was a turtle nesting ground. So one thing, even when turtles were able to get onto the island, because of that rock and clay, there really wasn't any suitable habitat for them to lay eggs. So we created a marsh feature to enable access onto the island, and then had nesting areas and some scrubland habitat created in that zone. Other shoreline habitats enhancements were also included in the project. We have some access points to the river created at various spots for people to better access the water. Fire pits were created, some rest areas, basking logs, spawning sites. I mentioned invasive species removals, and some enhancements to the vegetation existing on the island and along the shores. I'll just walk through some photos of the construction process. The first zone being the natural zone 1, linear pond and marsh. So before construction, just at the start of construction, you can see the area was fairly flat, relatively barren. A few trees here. These are mostly poplars that were growing in the area. So in the 2020 here, in the first phase of construction, We're excavating just some test pits here and there to see what the conditions were like underground. But then we also ran into an issue with Phragmites. So I mentioned that small area that had been identified at the beginning. Well, in the intervening years, couple of years between design and construction, and maybe just a more thorough inventory, we found that the Phragmites problem was far more extensive than we had thought, and was in fact pretty significantly covering the entire project area. So that created some issues for us. Because a lot of the area was getting excavated already, the idea, solution that we came up with was to excavate some areas where we were going to be creating fill piles for the excavated material anyways, burying the Phragmites at the bottom of those pits, and then covering it all with plywood. So this wasn't a particularly cost-effective solution, but because we were already excavating the material, it worked out reasonably well for us in this case. As we moved along, mentioned the fill piles. This was something that we hadn't actually thought about too much before we implemented the construction, was where all this fill was going to go. So we were able to reuse it for the most part on the project through the creation of these fill piles, and then also we're able to reuse some of the material in the community for other projects. The rock and the rocky base actually made a good road base for some other community projects that were going on. We did run into another issue when we were excavating here, and that we found an area that was contaminated soil and some other rubble. So that was another challenge that we had as we moved through the project, just getting that material removed from the community. Moving on into late 2021. So you see that the project elements are excavated. The two marsh zones located up here were actually constructed in what turned out to be a clay base. So these are sort of hydraulically isolated from the rest of the feature. The rest of the pond and marsh feature are in fact hydraulically connected to the bay, so they fluctuate with the water level in the bay. You can see the darker soil here. This is actually the dredge material that we excavated from the bay, and I'll talk about the dredging process in a little bit. And I'll just note, a lot of the trees that we did cut or take down during the construction process were reused on site for just some extra habitat features in the different areas. So this is in the spring of 2022. You can just see the entire project area, is covered in water. So this water stayed high for a couple of months in the spring and sort of gives some of that variability to the habitat with the water level dropping as the water level in the bay does as well. So this is now in the fall, and you can see that the water levels are down, the features are well defined again. And we subsequently planted more than 5,000 trees, shrubs, and plants to complement the growth that's occurring in this area. So the second natural zone, the turtle nesting ground, again, similar habitat, flat and fairly rocky material to begin with. And here really you can see just how rocky it was. So this was so rocky, in fact, that we had to bring in some extra fill material from the other project site just to create some kind of base that we could then put our topsoil on. There's also a bike path running through the island at this point, so we rerouted that bike path around the project area so that people could still pass through and see the element. Again, trying to integrate the human element with the environmental benefits of the project. Let me see. So here, this is in spring of 2021, bringing in topsoil to finish off the work. We also incorporated a number of hibernacula into the project. You can see 1, 2, 3, a bunch of hibernacula that were created for snakes that exist on the island. And we actually changed the design a little bit so that all of the turtle nesting sand mix wasn't all in one area. It was spread out into a few different locations, with some of those locations being a little further inland from the bay itself. Right, so for this element, rather than using the dredge material from the bay, because it took place a little bit ahead of the dredging process, we had imported topsoil for this element. And in fact, there's quite a bit of a seed bank in that that we're dealing with now. So interestingly, the topsoil created through the dredging process was actually quite good in that regard, in that we had very little seed bank within that mix. And just what the project is looking like at the moment. Again, we have the turtle nesting area here, and then a few extra clumps for turtle nesting in those areas. And over 3,000 plants were installed in this area as well. Through the design process, so there's extensive consultation, collaboration with the community on developing the design. And one thing that we heard quite frequently, there used to be a beach on the other side of the bay, and the community was really interested in having another beach feature created on the island. So we did that as a sort of addition to the project, created this beach element, imported beach sand, and the excavated material from this area was used as road base and other jobs in the community. Just a picture of the finished beach. So the dredging process, we used a hydraulic dredging operation. So we did have a challenge here with the subcontractor that was going to be completing this work. They were based in New Brunswick, and at the time in 2020, with the COVID lockdowns, they weren't able to come into Quebec at that time. So we had our dredging delayed for a year because of this, which caused some challenges in terms of the timing of the different project elements, as I mentioned, because we had hoped to use topsoil from the dredging for all of the project elements. Another challenge that we found as we were doing the dredging was there's actually an old roadway that many of the community members had mentioned to us during the design process, but we weren't able to locate at the time. But there's an old roadway that was constructed while they were filling the islands during the construction of the seaway. And so that old roadway is something that we're going to have to deal with, because it does interrupt that 40-meter wide flow channel that we had been planning on having. Just another picture of the dredging boat, and then also the aquatic plant harvester in the orange below. So we did do the aquatic plant harvesting in 2021, and unfortunately, those plants were coming back in pretty quickly again in 2022. So we did additional harvesting in 2022, and it seems clear that this is going to be an ongoing management challenge for us here. Despite our efforts to increase flow through the bay, we have to recognize it's an artificial system, and some ongoing management is always going to be required. As far as the aquatic plants, they were brought onto the island and composted, mixed in with some of the other materials that we were using. So one benefit that we had for the project was just the amount of space available for the dredging operation. So the original plan had been to use sediment bags to dewater the sediment, but our contractor, well, because of the delay we had with the dredging, we wanted to dry the material a little bit faster than what would be possible with the sediment bags, and our contractor came up with a unique process for doing that. So the dredge material is being pumped through a tube with some coagulants and other additives added at this location to help the sediment separate from the water solution. So we used one of two ponds where the material was pumped. When water would then cleanish water would then flow over into the secondary settling pond. Once that was full, water would trickle down through this series of baffles, again with some additional polymers to further enhance the separation into this final cleaning, polishing pond where any remaining sediment fell out, and then a series of straw bales. Ultimately, the water then would run through the rocky bay material here and end up back in the bay. So this was a very effective process, and the water was very clean that was re-entering the bay. The sediment was then excavated out of these pits and distributed in different locations around the project area for further dewatering. Sand was imported and mixed with the sediment to create the finished topsoil that was used throughout the project. Some of the other enhancements that we created through the project, access points in the top left. So I mentioned there's a series of basically stepped staircases just to increase the ability of community members to access the bay. On the top right, we have a wattle fence constructed around a few storm sewer outlets on the mainland side of the bay. We also created plunge pools at the outlet in the hopes of collecting some sediment that might be discharged from those storm sewers. In the bottom left was an add-on to the project. This is a bank swallow habitat structure. We were able to get some funding for that in early 2022 and constructed this as another element in the linear pond and marsh feature. And then on the bottom right, we have a little couple of benches and a viewing area that was created near the Turtle Bay Elders Lodge. And there's a lot of invasive species, and it wasn't possible to view the bay at this location prior to the project moving forward. And so we've created this little area for elders in that center to view the bay and enjoy the area. A number of environmental measures were implemented as we moved through the project. To highlight a few, we had exclusion fencing created around the project area. You can see in the bottom left here, those exclusion fences were tested pretty mightily by some snapping turtles and others. But we had about a 6-week period before project started within those excluded areas where we were removing and relocating snakes, turtles, and anything else that might be within those areas. Turbidity curtains were used for any of the in-water works, and we had the material reused, which saved a lot of environmental impacts associated with the project construction. We also had field monitors from KIPO, the Kahnawà Environment Protection Office, that were walking around the site, monitoring the fences on a daily basis. We also had a number of calls from community members who were actively walking around the area that helped us with our monitoring process as well. Funding for the work. So we accessed quite a few different funding sources to implement the project. We did find it quite challenging to fund studies to understand the problem, develop the solutions, estimate costs, at the beginning. So people are sometimes more willing to fund a project that's at a state of, ready to go, shovel in the ground kind of thing. And it can often be more challenging to get funding to prove a concept. So we accessed a number of different funding mechanisms to get that done. Environmental compensation. So we're working with light transit railway that's being built across the island of Montreal. They had some impacts to wetlands associated with their project, and so they contributed funding to construct some of the wetlands associated with the project. Program funding from Environment Canada programs contributed to some of the studies and that bank swallow habitat structure. And then reconciliation. So we have a standing Kahnawà Canada relations table And because of the historic impacts associated with the seaway, there was a recognition that there was responsibility from Canada and the Seaway Authority in contributing to the problem that we were facing here in the communities. And so significant funds were transferred due to that recognition. And then also some partnerships. So for example, working with the St. Lawrence Seaway Management Corporation and local watershed organizations. So Scabrick is a watershed organization nearby us, and they included the works that we were planning in their watershed plans. So having that documentation that really helps in terms of securing funding when it's shown that it's sort of a goal of a larger region, and there's been some significant thought put into it. Monitoring is going to be an ongoing process for us. Shown here, turtles seem to be using the area already in the top left. So they're laying eggs not only in the turtle nesting areas, but also just in any of the topsoil areas. So that's really encouraging to see. In fact, even we had the sediment or the exclusion area, parts of the exclusion area were secured in place with sand, and turtles were even trying to use that sand to lay eggs. So there's clearly a need for sand on the island for them to do that. We had some hatchlings in the top right in the project, even as the project was ongoing. In the bottom left, the bank swallows took up nest in the habitat structure within a week or two of completion of that element of the project. And we had over 100 fledglings this year. And then brown snakes are present on the island, and we're hoping they'll expand more out of that remnant natural zone into some of the other features that have been created. So of course, there's other elements to monitor as well. Invasive species are prevalent all throughout the region. And so trying to keep a handle on those is going to be important for us moving forward. Some erosion in some different areas of the project that we'll want to make sure how we get stabilized. And then the aquatic plants continue to be a challenge for us, and making sure that we have the resources to continue to keep that flow channel open. Luckily, we have secured funding for a dedicated field monitor for the next 3 years to start that work of continuing the project going. So I'd just like to acknowledge some of the project partners. RML Landscaping was the primary contractor for the project. So they're a local company to Kahnawà, and that was really great. They were invested in the project, they're aware of community needs, and were making recommendations along the way to improve the project. So that was really helpful. ACOM did the detailed design and assisted with oversight of the plantings associated with the project. So in total, there were close to 20,000 plants that were installed as part of the work. Geomorphics provided construction supervision throughout the project and assisted with the tendering process as well. And I'll just give a credit for all of the pictures, or most of the pictures within the presentation were provided by them as well. So that was very helpful. A couple of our funders, the Réseau Express Metropolitain, as I mentioned, were a significant contributor to those 2 natural zones that I showed. And then Canada, both through Economic Development Canada, Environment Climate Change Canada, and Crown Indigenous Relations have all contributed to the project. I just want to say a big Nyawagoa for your attention, and I will stop my presentation there. Thank you.
Miigwech, Patrick and Cole, for that great presentation and all the sharing with us all the great work that you are doing in the Kahnawà community. It's unfortunate that all of our communities need to undergo that kind of work because of colonization and the displacement of our people. But it's great to see the work and the collaboration that's going on there. And again, thank you so much for sharing that presentation. Next, I would like to introduce Joe Cavello, who is unfortunately unavailable to be live with us today, but he has pre-recorded his presentation. So Joseph has over 24 years of experience in environmental consulting with LGL Limited. Prior to joining LGL, Joseph worked with conservation authorities throughout Southern Ontario, dealing mainly with aquatic habitat assessment and remediation. With LGL Limited, he has contributed field and mapping support to numerous fish habitat assessments, First Nations habitat remediation projects, site feasibility assessments, subwatershed level assessments, environmental impact studies, natural heritage inventories at a municipal and watershed scale, and a variety of transportation planning and design projects. Joseph has worked with First Nations mainly in Southern Ontario, including Walpole Island, Amjamong First Nation, and Saugeen Ojibwe. Joseph has extensive experience with the life science of Ontario fishes, including cold, cool, and warm water species, as well as many species at risk. He has successfully secured Federal Fisheries Act authorization and Species at Risk Act permits, as well as Provincial Endangered Species Act and Section 17(2)(c) permits. He has particular expertise in the design and restoration of aquatic habitat impacted by human or natural disturbances. He is also involved in the management of GIS services to these projects using software, which includes AutoCAD, MapInfo, ArcView, and supporting digital imaging software. Joseph has been qualified as a fisheries assessment specialist under fisheries specialty in the Ministry of Transportation, Registry Appraisal and Qualification System, has participated in the ROM, Freshwater Fish ID Workshop, the DFO, Freshwater Mussel ID Workshop, has attended numerous sediment and erosion control workshops, has been certified as an electrofishing crew leader, and has participated in the Robert Newberry Natural Channel Design course in Kelowna, BC. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mario to play the recording, Joseph's recording.
Hello, my name is Joe Cavallo, and I'm a fisheries biologist with LGL Limited. Today I'll be talking about the Swan Lake Marsh Habitat Creation Project that was completed in cooperation with and on the lands of the Walpole Island First Nation. I'm sorry I can't be with you today, so I've pre-recorded this presentation. You can see on this slide a few photos of what I'll be talking about today. In the top right is Clint Jacobs for this left with some of his Heritage Center members. Top left is a pugnose shiner, which is a provincially threatened fish species. Bottom left is our control structure for the marsh, and bottom right is our shallow littoral habitat zone that we've created. The history of this project starts in 2008 when LGL and a study team completed an individual environmental assessment for a wharf expansion in the Goderich Harbor, which was completed on behalf of the Goderich Port Management Corporation. The Goderich Wharf expansion resulted in a harmful alteration, destruction, or disruption to fish habitat, and as such, we consulted with First Nations communities to hear their concerns and gain valuable input. Between 2008 and 2017, several meetings occurred with First Nations to develop opportunities for fisheries restoration in order to comply with DFO compensation requirements for the loss of fish habitat. Walpole Island, Amjamong, Saugeen Ojibwe, and Kettle and Stony Point First Nations were all consulted during this time. On June 14, 2017, DFO issued a Fisheries Act authorization for the wharf expansion in the Goderich Harbor. A fisheries compensation plan was included and consisted of the following: the Swan Lake Marsh Open Water Habitat Creation Project with Walpole Island First Nation, the St. Clair River Shoreline Shoal Creation with Amjamong First Nation, and a stable isotope analysis study with the Saugeen Ojibwe First Nation. This presentation will focus on the Swan Lake Marsh Habitat Creation Project. The conditions before restoration. Well, Swan Lake Marsh is on St. Anne Island, and it's a triangular shaped area approximately 160 acres in size. The wetland is isolated from the adjacent Chennai Acart, also known as Snai Creek, which is an arm of the St. Clair River, by a constructed dike which maintains the wetland. The average elevation of the marsh is well above the adjacent agricultural lands to the north and the adjacent Chennai Acart to the east and south, especially during lower water conditions. Prior to restoration, the marsh was dominated by Phragmites and cattails, and the area generally consisted of poor quality and a low diversity of habitat. You can see in the bottom left picture, there's the red dotted line, which depicts the larger 160 acre Swan Lake Marsh area. And the yellow highlighted area is the area we will be talking about today that's been restored. And in the bottom right, the photo from August 2013 shows the dominance of Phragmites in the marsh at that time. Several fish, vegetation, and wildlife species at risk are known in this area. And with specific regard to aquatic species, the following have been found near Swan Lake Marsh: grass pickerel, pug-nosed minnow, pug-nosed shiner, spotted sucker, black-striped top minnow, eastern pond mussel, lake chubsucker, and lilliput. These species are namely within Chennai Acart, but with the connection we've created in the new marsh, there is the potential for these species to use the new habitats. In 2013, Walpole Island, the Royal Ontario Museum, and LGL conducted fish sampling in the Swan Lake Marsh Perimeter Canal, which was the only area with open water habitat. And we managed to capture many common fish species, as well as grass pickerel, a provincial species of special concern. And you can see in the pictures below, these are the pictures of the grass pickerel we caught at that time. And this was completed with Erling Holm of the ROM. As part of the habitat creation planning, we knew that several fish species were captured in the perimeter canal, but the majority of the marsh at that time was a raised, dry cattail and Phragmites marsh that had little to no open water habitat. And it was Walpole Island's desire to create an open water habitat specifically for fish, but also for native vegetation and wildlife. So Walpole and LGL undertook several design iterations until one was finally approved. And you can see in the bottom left, that's the larger Swan Lake Marsh area and what Walpole Island wanted it to look like, with several areas of open water habitat. And on the right is the final approved design of the smaller wetland area that was restored. The goal of the proposed restoration was to increase the extent of year-round fish habitat and to increase biodiversity in the wetland. This was completed via the creation of open water habitat through a direct connection to Chennai Acart, creating conditions unsuitable for Phragmites and favorable for the native cattails, floating, and submergent aquatic macrophytes. The maintenance of perennial fish habitat was a requirement by DFO, and this was completed using an inlet-outlet structure with a carp grate installed to discourage adult carp from entering the marsh. The design incorporated a variety of depths to provide a diversity of habitats for fish, ranging from shallow littoral areas with submergent, floating, and emergent vegetation to deep areas greater than 3 meters for summer and winter refuge. The marsh was constructed by Bob Lozon, also known as Grizz, a local wetland construction expert with decades of experience. The surrounding riparian areas were seeded using a native seed mix provided by Ontario Nativescape. In August 2017, construction began, and you can see in the bottom left the inlet-outlet structure that was installed. The carp grate is on the other side, on the upstream side, to discourage carp from entering the marsh. In the top right, you can see the excavation of the main deep water area of the marsh. And in the bottom right, there I am with Bob Lozon discussing the construction and design of the marsh. In August 2018, LGL went back to monitor and to see and assess the conditions, and we had success. We had a marsh, and you can see in the top left the main area of the marsh, and our deep water area is full of water and functioning as a marsh. And you can see in the other two photos on the right and the bottom, we have our beautiful littoral zone areas full of native vegetation, useful for juveniles and spawning fish. We continued to monitor in 2018, 2019, and completed some fish sampling. Unfortunately, as you can see in the top left, carp were in the marsh, so they did get past the grate. We also managed to capture other native fish species, including largemouth bass, bluegill, brook silverside, gizzard shad, as well as golden shiner. In 2020, we completed a habitat assessment, and as you can see, there's still plenty of water in the marsh. We have our littoral zone in the top left, and we confirmed deep water areas greater than 3 meters. Top right, unfortunately, Phragmites is well established in the drier areas. And the bottom right just shows the open water habitat areas. This year we completed spring and fall monitoring for fish and completed fish sampling. We managed to capture largemouth bass, yellow perch, pumpkin seed, and officially our second species at risk captured in Swan Lake Marsh, pugnose shiner, which is a provincially threatened species. In October, we captured emerald shiner and a second pugnose shiner, and in total we captured 10 native fish species in the marsh throughout the monitoring period, including bluegill, blunt-nosed minnow, brook silverside, emerald shiner, gizzard shad, golden shiner, largemouth bass, pumpkin seed, pugnose shiner, yellow perch, and then our exotic common carp and goldfish. In conclusion, restoration has been a success. We've maintained open water fish habitat. We've captured 10 species of native fish, and we've observed numerous wildlife and native vegetation species. The approximate size of the marsh we've restored is 15 acres, with 10 of those acres in open water habitat. One thing to keep in mind is this marsh is just one piece of the larger marsh, which is also being restored or has been restored by Walpole Island First Nation. You can see a good illustration here of the drastic change in habitat from 2015 in the top left to 2020 in the bottom right. Monitoring is set to conclude in 2023, which is year 5 of 5 of the DFO monitoring period. The objectives of the marsh restoration have been met, namely the creation of high-quality fish habitat and suitability for native fish species. Future challenges include fluctuating water levels and the presence of non-native species such as Phragmites and carp. I'd like to conclude this presentation and thank you all for listening. And of course, many thanks to Walpole Island First Nation, and in particular, Clint Jacobs and the Heritage Center. Thank you.
So I'd like to introduce Clint Jacobs, who will go off of Patrick's presentation. So Clint is an Anishinaabe from Bekeswanong, Walpole Island First Nation on the north shore of Lake St. Clair. He is the supervisor of Ninda Wabijig Walpole Island Heritage Center and leads a team that implements numerous initiatives relating to conservation, natural heritage education, habitat stewardship and restoration, and environmental research. Clint is also the founder and president of the Walpole Island Land Trust. Its goal is to enhance the ability to conserve and protect ecologically significant habitats and species at risk within Bekeswanong territory. Clint was a co-chair of the National Aboriginal Council on Species at Risk from 2018 to 2021 and is an adjunct Indigenous scholar at the University of Windsor and co-instructs field courses with the University of Windsor and Western University. So with that, I hand it over to you, Clint.
Hey, Gretch, sharing my screen here. So like what was shared earlier, I am going to be talking about Swan Lake Marsh, which is located on St. Anne Island at Walpole Island First Nation, in a project that we undertook from 2009 to 2019. And it continued with the work that Joe Cavello and LGL conducted. Anyhow, so a bit about Swan Lake Marsh. It was a project that focused on this, one of the smaller diked-in marshes at Walpole Island First Nation. It's located in the St. Clair area concern, area number 1. And the project scope was developed in collaboration with input from our community. And the main project scope was to conduct fieldwork to gather baseline data on fish and wildlife in the wetland, to use that baseline data gathered to develop our wetland restoration and management plan for Swan Lake Marsh, and to implement the plan to help improve the ecological functions and biological diversity of Swan Lake Marsh. So there's where it's at. You can see the southern part of the delta at Walpole Island is primarily all wetlands. We're one of the largest wetlands in the Great Lakes Basin. But this talk is going to talk about this small 160, 170 acre marsh that we call Swan Lake Marsh. Like I mentioned, we spent months talking to our community, seeking their input to help us develop goals for this project. And their input included to continue an ongoing dialogue with our community to build and maintain that support, to restore the marsh's ecological functions and enhance wildlife populations, to take steps to control non-native species such as Phragmites and research potential uses for it, to train community members to conduct environmental habitat and wildlife assessments and surveys, and to educate youth and bring them together with elders and community members to help them learn about wetlands, ecological hunting practices, survival techniques, language and stories, cultural teachings, and so on. Take you back. Most of the marshes out here in this photo are leased to hunting interests, and they have been for hundreds of years now. And this marsh here at Swan Lake Marsh was one of the first diked-in marshes at Walpole. And so we continued with that practice. So we leased a marsh for a 10-year period, and these are the supporters that helped us with that, and that included the Walpole Island First Nation Economic Development Department, Friends of the St. Clair River, Ducks Unlimited, Wildlife Habitat Canada, and our land trust at Walpole Island. So we started off by getting support through a band council resolution that from Walpole Island First Nation Chief and Council back in the day. And this set us out on our journey over the next 10 years. I'm going to show some before and after what this site looked like. And so before we took this on, this marsh had been being used for quite some time. And like I said, it was one of the first diked-in marshes and had hunting interest from the US and also Toronto that come in and leased a marsh from our First Nation and was using it. We had a duck hunt club there and just like the other marshes at Walpole. But this is what it looked like. Nobody that actually worked at this marsh or hunted it through a hunt club for probably a decade before we took this project on. So it sat kind of idle. You can see it's just a monoculture of primarily cattails. So that's from 2010. Here's an aerial photo we took, flew over the marsh, and you can see there's pretty much no open water. During those 4 months that I engaged and interacted with my community, asking people that had some sort of interest had hunted that marsh, had worked for them. One of the hunt clubs that over its history might have managed that marsh or fished or trapped or gathered plants from this marsh. They told me that this marsh was 2/3 open water. When you look at that, that marsh is sure not 2/3 open water. So that was kind of a goal that we're trying to look at and trying to set for, and kind of determine with the community's input, what direction should we go. You can see that the faint kind of yellowish tone along the perimeter of the marsh, that's invasive Phragmites. And so we started in 2013, really, and it took us from 2009 to 13, about 4 or 5 years to actually get this project rolling. Our Heritage Center is basically a not-for-profit, though we're not registered as one. Our land trust is, though. So it took us a bit to get the ball rolling, to get funding secured, applying for grants, writing proposals, and so on, to undertake the work that our community wanted us to do. So we finally got some funding in place. We were able to hire a few people, but also sought input from people that would help and volunteer and help us gather baseline data. And my colleague here at the time, Carl Smith Sr., who was helping myself and my colleague Naomi Williams gather some sediment to help us determine whether or not there's any concerns around pollution or contamination of the sediments. We also utilized our traditional management here and burned the marsh back in 2013. We had other people from the community that helped clear vegetation, helped us with the landing area where there used to be a hunt club. A number of different people volunteered and just came forward. The whole goal again was to develop a restoration management plan. And so it took us this time to gather this baseline data and find out what was there. So a lot of surveys were being conducted. We had to assess the dike itself, find out whether or not it was breached or how wide it was, what the condition was, and for us to do any restoration or reconstruction work on the dike. We did that work, cleared the vegetation, which was primarily Phragmites, with the help of those men there. And we contracted a couple individuals. Unfortunately, one there has passed. But we had some local expertise in our community and some equipment, and we were able to fortify and reconstruct the dike and prevent any, in some spots of that dike was only 2 feet wide. And so here's a photo from 2014 after that dike reconstruction happened. You can see the perimeter of the marsh is nice and kind of grayish white. That's the clay that was excavated and moved to fortify that dike. To help with the shoreline, which is naturalized, to help prevent it from being further eroded, we recruited people from our community, including students from our elementary school. And here they're planting swamp white oak and other species along the dike, along the riverside of the dike, to help fortify that dike. Again, you remember that photo that we had initially. This is just a monotone of vegetation across the interior of the marsh. And so where do we begin? You can see where the excavation work actually started. We had to draw the water down from the marsh. Otherwise, we would have been in water or muck. So we drew the water down, and it was challenging because of the weather conditions. At the time this work began, the water levels in the lakes were quite low. So this was perfect timing for us to kind of do this work. And the work continued. We also contracted others to help us excavate. So here we got Bob Lozon and others that were mentioned earlier, excavating some of the ponds and also the connecting channels within the marsh. Our goal was to try to create some more open water habitat throughout the marsh, not just at that 15-acre marsh wetland that we created in the northeast corner of the marsh with LGL and others there. So you can see some of the work. as it was progressing. And there's some of the plans that people asked us to do. They just basically, we come out, we'd attend different community events, and we ask people or interview people and visit them at their homes or out in the water or out in the marsh, and ask them, how would you like, what should we do here, and what should this marsh look like? And so people were just kind of drawing on maps and other things to help us. But here we are, and that was one of the key things that people are saying that they wanted to have, is restore ecological functions. Because the marsh had been diked in for so long, no water was flowing through the marsh. And so we installed these fishways and then water structures to allow water to flow, but also fish to, and gated structures to allow certain fish to come through in water as well. And we got to thank many different funding sources for this support. This is kind of what that marsh looked like in 2018. Again, we flew over the marsh. And then what we're seeing in the forefront is that 15-acre marsh that LGL and had constructed. And then again, that was an offset project that we conducted. The other work that happened throughout the rest of that marsh, what was not an offset, it was just funding applications, and that we primarily received funding from Environment Climate Change Canada and others. Here's another image of that marsh looking west. You can see there's a lot more open water in this marsh, so we're able to kind of work towards those goals that our community has kind of set out for us. And definitely, back in 2013, we had support from Royal Natural Museum. We invited them out, and they helped us kind of assess, at the time, primarily the interior channel along the dike, to see what was there. And this is primarily what they found. A lot of mud meadows, and we also had a grass pickerel, a small largemouth bass, and also a golden shiner. Erling Holm and others were able to help us with that. And they did do a small report for us, so we're really grateful. And for those that know, mud minnows are an indicator of a poor quality habitat, and so we knew that and they can live in mud. We had other volunteers throughout the initial start of our project back in 2013, 14, and so on. People coming out, helping us assess plants, and we even recruited children from this community and youth. And we basically loaded them up with cameras and put them in, let them walk the dike or canoe in the channels. And we give them cameras. If they didn't know the certain species, we just asked if they would photograph that species and come back to shore, and we'd go over the photos, and this helped us build a list of species that were at Swan Lake Marsh at that time. And so here's some of the photos that some of the youth captured. You know, you see some Canada geese and the water snakes and so on. Others in the community helped us conduct wildlife surveys through that time on a regular basis, each of the seasons that we can get out. And we actually had in 2014 support from Environment Climate Change Canada that funded it, but we had the involvement of Fisheries and Oceans Canada that helped us do an assessment of the habitat there and fish communities in the marsh there, as well as outside the marsh. Because we were thinking about at the time about opening up or creating some sort of structures that allow water to flow in. We wanted to know what was going to be outside of the marsh as well, outside of the dike and the Clair River, Chenelly Cart. So we were doing water quality assessments and assessing the sediment, as well as doing surveys and so on for fish and wildlife. We're able to share some of the results of the work through print publications in our community, or one of our newsletters that we published through Nidawabjik, as well as kind of acknowledge and thank people that came out from different institutions, including Western University. We also had Centennial College and others that helped us gather some information, helped us in clearing vegetation and creating areas for people to kind of, in the public to use, some trails and so on. And here's our early list of those species that we're able to gather with the support of lots of different people, as well as work from LGL and others and staff that gathered information from community, from that marsh. We also want to acknowledge all the partners that were involved. So again, we got acknowledging the different partners that helped us with this and funded the work that was occurring at Swan Lake Marsh. I got some media attention as well through newspapers and so on. But here's some of the partners that helped us with this work. So we're grateful for their support and involvement. Some of the highlights from this project is one, that we were able to develop this restoration and management plan that would guide the work that we conducted over that initial period of the restoration work that we did. Again, we were definitely involving the community, informing them as much as we can through regular print publications, through radio shows, through social media, through gatherings, in-person gatherings, things that we call ecosystem circles, where we're not just informing, but we're actually having a dialogue with the community, hearing their thoughts and getting their perspectives and ideas and wisdom and advice. More of those types of things at other community events, at public open houses within the community, through print publications and our newsletters, articles that we're sharing about the progress of the work that's happening, other community gatherings, both in the community, but also outside of the community. So we're sharing information at different places, not just at Walpole Island, but also places like Chippewas and Thames First Nation and other places in the region. We got out at many events like our powwows or our fall fairs. And again, we're just seeking input, seeking advice, sharing progress results and so on. And here's another setup that we had at one of the public events, probably our fall fair. Some of the lessons learned through this is we definitely had some challenges, and external funding sources timelines are extremely challenging to work within, especially when contracts and funds are received late in the year, sometimes in the fall, maybe early winter. Weather is a constant driving force. Timeline setbacks are to be expected, especially dealing with challenging weather conditions. Water levels can work with or against the proposed restoration works. But going forward, we're definitely looking at, and we need to establish long-term funding mechanisms such as endowment funds to support long-term goals with continuous funding. We need to ensure that we are involving and informing in our community, building capacity to ensure goals are driven by our First Nation. And we're looking at standardizing data gathering methods for land, air, water, species, and so on with others in the region, so we can have a comparative analysis in the future. So trying to meet those March 31st timelines that we're all experiencing is sometimes impossible. Especially when we're trying to draw down the water here at Swan Lake Marsh to conduct the excavation work and restoration works. Heavy rain events are now becoming a common thing, a norm with climate change. So we'd often make 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And sometimes the opposite of that, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I would have preferred to have drawn down the water in the marsh and excavate the ponds and connecting channels and totally truck out and move the sediment out of interior of the marsh onto the dikes or dry land areas near adjacent to the marsh. But because we had to work within those March 31st timelines and deadlines of our funders, we only had time to deposit the sediments next to the ponds and connecting channels within the marsh, which later became vectors for the spread of invasive species like Phragmites and predators such as coyotes and etc. throughout the interior of the marsh. So we definitely need to establish these endowment funds to support long-term goals with continuous long-term funding to facilitate that long-term monitoring, citizen science, aftercare and maintenance works, outdoor learning and educational goals, our cultural and spiritual relationship building and connections with plants, animals, fish, water, and habitat, our sustenance-based hunting and fishing for survival and overall health, our mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health, and supporting creation of all life forms. And I would not and will not do any projects in the future without having these long-term funding mechanisms such as endowment funds in place. It was too much of a nightmare trying to cobble bits and pieces of funding together over the years to achieve our goals and for it all to come to an end, especially when we needed it the most. To continue on the studying and assessing the impacts, good or bad, of our works. Miigwech. You can reach me at clint.jacobs@wifn.org.
Miigwech for that, Clint, and please extend our miigwech to Joe as well for his presentation in partnership with you at Walpole. So with that, I would like to call say miigwech to all of our panelists, but also call all of our panelists to turn on their cameras at this time. We do have a little bit of time for questions, and I do have a couple of questions here for both Clint as well as Cole and Patrick. We're going to go with Clint first. I know Clint has a pretty sharp stop today, so Clint, this question is for you. How effective was the burying of marsh for dealing with Phragmites long term?
Was that burning of the marsh?
Burying, B-U-R-I-N-G.
Burying, I'm not sure what that is.
No, burying, sorry. But so burying of the Phragmites.
Not effective at all. Phragmites takes lots of different things and it's ambitious and then wants to survive. Was this for Cole?
This is actually, it's supposed to be burning. It is supposed to be burning. Okay. I just seen in the chat. Right. How effective was the burning of the marsh for dealing with Phragmites long term?
Yeah.
My apologies.
It's one of the things that we need to do. And burning has been part of our traditions for millennia. We have key windows in the seasons to do that. But for us, it helped clear off, see what was underlying there. But in fact, it in some cases, it actually can promote the spread of Phragmites just because we're clearing off other vegetation. So I see in and around our community at other places, including the US, they've been researching techniques to control Phragmites, including burning, cutting, mowing, spraying with rodeo or Roundup, flooding, all those things you have to employ. If you go down to Walpole and you cross our bridge, my dad just lives south of the bridge. It's the only spot that you see that's clear of any Phragmites because he's out there every 2 weeks cutting the frag. And I asked, the work that I do is we're also informing the community about invasive species. So one time I asked, I said, why are you cutting the frag? But I thought he was going to say, because you're sharing information and why it's a bad thing and blah, blah, blah. But in fact, he said, because I want a good spot for my grandkids to be able to swim. So we have different reasons for why we want to manage the species. But yeah, anyhow, so it takes, we had sprayed it in some pilot spots back in 2012 within the community, and within 3 years, it all came back. So you have to have long-term funding to be able to tackle the species if that's your goal. We're also looking at trying to find ways to utilize it. I remember we had a community event where up to that point, we're spending most of that year asking community, how can we control this thing? And one of our last sessions, an elder stood up and said, hey, the species are here because we're either haven't been good caretakers, teaching us a lesson, or it's here to tell us that it's here to benefit us some way. So we need to figure that out. And so that's kind of what we've been trying to do. Not many people out there trying to fund research into this, so we have to find other supporters to help us with that goal of trying to find out how it may benefit us.
Thanks, Clint, for that. I love how you mentioned that, you know, there are purposes. I know in our culture, everything has a purpose, right? And so it's often something that I've heard from our elders as well, especially when we're talking about invasive species and climate change even, is that we need to stop eradicating and take a moment to step back and ask those species why they're here.
Absolutely.
Right? So then they help us manage. So thank you for that. I'm going to actually ask you one more question because I know you have to leave, but how do they plan to manage the Phragmites going forward to make sure it doesn't creep back in?
Oh, that's another challenge. So again, we're project based at Indigenous-led, our Heritage Center, and we don't have any funding to continue on this work. So that's over the next couple of years. I'm working to establish these endowment funds so that I don't have to stop things. We can just continue working on whatever projects that we're working on. So we're looking at different techniques. We're looking at everything that's around it. And there's lots of research going on. There's a Phragmites network that's happening in Ontario. There's lots of work that's happening across the river in St. John's Marsh, and which is part of the delta here at Walpole and this delta here at St. Clair River Delta. We're still trying to figure that out with our community. And maybe we can find some funding to be able to do that research and ask. And that's one of the things that one of our elders actually said, is we have to have a naming ceremony and ask, you know, give this being a name in our culture, in our language, and then we can properly ask it, why is it here? So we got to carry that out.
Miigwech for that, Clint. So the next question I have is for Patrick and Cole. What does a partnership with or request to SMC look like? And how challenging is reconciling with their history when they are the cause of a lot of the damage in the first place?
Yeah, I can take a first try at that. I mean, I guess it's true that you know, community members obviously hold the Seaway Authority responsible for what's happened in the community, and so, you know, our approach working with them, I guess, has been, you know, to challenge them on that and to push them to take responsibility and contribute to the work that we're doing. So early on in the process, we were talking more with them about the project, and they did fund some of the early studies and investigations. At some point, you know, they let us know that they are basically funded by Transport Canada, and so we should move the conversation to that level, I guess, if we're looking for to move beyond smaller contributions. So, you know, it's challenging. Obviously, they have their mandate as well, and so occasionally they'll need to do dredging or other activities in the community, and often that's when, you know, we get a better response level from them and some more engagement. So I guess I would say, yeah, it's been a bit of a challenging relationship, but you know, we try to hold them responsible for some of the stuff, and yeah, ultimately they have provided some positive assistance.
Thanks, Patrick. Cole, did you want to add to that?
Just to say that the community continues to have a lot of resentment towards the Seaway, and so I think more could be done there to improve the relationship with the community.
Thank you. So it looks like we're at time. I would like to again say Chimigwach to all of our speakers today. The wisdom, knowledge, and insight that you've provided today has, I am sure, helped our audience understand what can be accomplished when we have open minds and more importantly, open hearts as we undertake this important work. I would also like to say Chimigwach to the Latornell Steering Committee members that helped make this webinar happen, including Jamie Doherty, Nicholas Burnett, Mario Millet, and Karen Anderson. The Littoral Conservation Symposium has been reinstated. As I mentioned, we did have a in-person session in October, and these webinars are building off of that. Also, as a reminder that this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the Latornell Symposium website for anyone to watch. Give us a couple days to get it posted. And we will be back on the 6th with our next webinar, Keeping Up with Planning in Ontario. One more thing before you leave, please complete our last polls on the screen. And we would like to also invite Ahona Wagarne to come back and close our meeting.
Gweza Wagwego.